Hello, my name is Chris Woodpan. I'm the owner of Ingot Film Studios, and I am working with Hero Time to make a bunch of videos to help you get your products ready for print. In this episode, we're going to talk about setting up your cards for print. Now, when you're setting up cards, they tend to be on one sheet and they tend to have a lot of different colors on them. So let's just dive into what happens on the heavily saturated colors that people like to use on the backs of cards. Okay, so you have this awesome back of your card that you want to print, and you have a couple options when it comes to this. But you need to understand how the printers work a little bit better so that you can lay these out appropriately. Also know that if you just send individual cards in, that this is what the team on the backside is going to be doing. So how you set up these cards and what your expectations are need to be managed a little bit. Even though we have these fancy printers that do multiple colors, there are still limitations to how things can print. So what happens when you have colors that are very similar that might be next to each other? Now, refer back to previous episodes where we've talked about how to color balance your colors and managing the CMYK levels of each one, because that's going to be very important to understand as we dive into this. So if I start out with a card that, say, has 80% of cyan in the color, and then the card next to it might have, let's say, something small like 10-15%, what can happen is the colors may actually bleed a little bit. So that 20% or 10% that you expect that C to be might be 5 or 10 points higher, which will alter the color of that. And now it might be very small and not noticeable, but there are creators out there who that is absolutely unacceptable. So understanding that if you put something that has that much of a value of a color in it next to something that's a little lighter, it's not going to get the exact result you think. Understanding that effectively out of the gate is going to open up the rest of our conversation. So let's talk a little bit about plates and how they actually work. So when we have a plate, it's going to go into the printer and it's going to go straight in. Now, when we actually print this, the way color looks at the plate is in vertical lines. So we can adjust and dial color within those individual vertical lines. But when we actually look at the plate and its grouping, when it's cut in horizontal lines. Why is that important? Well, it's important because if you want cards grouped together, you tend to group them horizontally so that they can then be cut and stacked. But that's not the way printers need to be set up. Printers need to be set up for the vertical axis in order to be able to get good colors. So what that means is your cards may not be grouped perfectly at that point. We have a couple options when it comes to dealing with this. Number one is that you can just accept that there may be very slight and subtle variations in colors between your cards. And when I say that, it's pretty non-noticeable. 10% cyan difference in one card to the next is not that big of a deal, but it might be for your game. So just bear that in mind. The other option is organizing your cards for optimum printing and not for grouping. So what that means is we're going to group them vertically, and then we're not really going to care so much when the cards come out, get cut and stacked. So how do some people handle this? Well, there's two ways that some publishers can handle this. Number one might be that you set up multiple plates. So for instance, you have just one card back that runs on one plate and then another card back that runs on another. So that kind of negates the problem. If it's all one color, you don't have to worry about variation from band to band. So the other option that's available is literally changing the colors. So that one color that we used previously that is 80% cyan that sits next to a 10% cyan color, drop that 10% cyan out and make that color slightly different, in which case now those two being next to each other is not going to matter because there's no cyan overlap. So even in today's modern printing presses, ink still flows, and it still is a liquid medium that does move around a little bit, and it can cause some slight variations in cards. So we want to make sure that you understand the process so that when you go to create your cards, you get exactly what you want, and that you understand what limitations exist in the real world. So remember, when it comes time to cutting things, that it's grouped horizontally, top to bottom, left to right. But when it comes to printing things, we look vertically. So those two things can be at odds. Don't forget, you have 4 remedies for this. Number 1, you can just live with it. It might be such a subtle difference that it just doesn't matter. The other option is to reorganize your cards more for printing than for that cutting at the end. So they are grouped together in vertical columns. Another option is to change the colors so that you don't have a highly saturated color of one type next to a similar color of a lower saturation that may cause that variation in the first place. And then last, but most costly, is to actually go and have different plates run for different colors. That way you can avoid the problem altogether and get the exact result you want. This might be the best option if you are running a large amount of cards, as it will definitely yield a better result over larger groups. So stay tuned. The next ones are going to be talking about importing your things into Photoshop or Illustrator so that you can actually use them. And then we'll talk about, in the end, exporting and getting those files completely wrapped up and done. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.